Hello, everyone, and welcome to the distribution team demo for December 2nd. I'm just going to share my screen here to start with. So early in the week, we didn't have a demo volunteer, so I'm just going to use this time to show a little bit of debugging tools and tricks related to the Rails console and kind of specific to things that we often might end up doing in distribution. So that's kind of the two things we'll often do in the Rails console is use it to confirm that a setting that's been applied through Omnibus and through the charts has actually made it into the code base in a way that it can actually be checked within the running application. And the other is when that's not working, trying to debug why that's not working. So that's kind of the an often case for that. I have the Omnibus image running in Docker. I've execed into it, and I'll just run the console here to get into the console. I threw a couple links in the demo notes. I'll just bring up the one of them here from the Rails API documentation. But when you load the console, there's a couple things that are kind of loaded in scope at the time, and it's these console methods, and you get these 5 methods by default that kind of help you set up the environment as if it was something happening in the real live Rails application. So when you load the console, it's your own Rails instance, but what it's missing is it's not running a web server. It's not receiving any requests or traffic, and so a lot of the code in the application is relying on expecting there to be a session potentially with a current user coming from the browser, for there to be application controller that's actually being accessed at the moment, for example, and for the app to be fully loaded. So by default, when you first bring up the console, none of these are loaded, but the moment you call any one of these helpers, you get at least an instance of what it's trying to do. So for our scenario that I'll be showing off today, this is related to MR that Dimitro is reviewing right now. I'll just bring it over here. Is that we were trying to test a new setting for adding a Google Tag Manager ID to the application. So the ID had to be added through Omnibus and charts, and then we wanted to confirm that that setting was being actually making it all the way through to the application in a way that it is actually being used. So in the application, one of the main sections that it's called that we were using for debugging is in the auth helper. This Google Tag Manager enabled call was there. So kind of the default, and when trying to check this call, this auth helper is a helper that gets included during rendering. So this is like rendering a view helper essentially. But for less complicated helpers, you would often just type in the class name and follow it with whatever the method is to test it. And it existed and it returned false in this case. And that can be one of the easiest ways to test it. What we ran into with this one is that this is as you go in and start enabling, like as you start going through this method to try to make sure each thing is enabled, that this gets becomes a more and more complicated helper that relies on other helpers, and that when you're calling it this way, really nothing has been loaded. Like you just loaded this class that was only meant to ever be included in other classes, and the way we're calling it here actually isn't the way it ever gets called anywhere else, and that can lead to some unexpected behavior. But let's go ahead and change our application, just try and start moving through this. So I haven't edited, I haven't changed any of my GitLab RB yet. So we're gonna go ahead and do that. So for this particular feature, it's only enabled in a dev environment where Rails env equals development, which we can't use in charts or in Omnibus, just because we don't have a Rails environment at this point. We've built kind of like a production version of GitLab, so we can't enable the dev environment, or for .com. So for this testing, I'm going to have to lie to it and make it think that it's .com. So we're going to tell it it's GitLab.com. And then the other thing we're going to need for this specific test is we actually need to set in this case, we're working with we want to work with well, I guess we can work with either one. We were specifically testing the nonce earlier. Well, actually, yeah, we'll still do the nonce. So that's this one. The image I'm in is a merge request still work in progress. So one of the things that is open to fix in it is that this example template was a little bit wrong. It was missing the extra prefix in there. And we're not actually going to have this do anything. So I'm just going to leave the default text as just to have it enabled. So in order to reload that config, we need to run reconfigure. And we will actually have to reload our console over here once that's done to bring in the new config file changes. For this GitLab.com test, I'm actually going to have to make one other change that's a little difficult to make in the charts. So this, whether it's .com or not, is handled in like a URL comparison. So you saw I changed our URL to gitlab.com, but they're actually specifically checking against HTTPS, which I don't have a certificate in the Omnibus instance. Because I'm in the Omnibus, I don't have to work with pods coming up and down. I can actually just change that directly in this file. What I mean by that is actually finding the file. Changing it. And then coming over here and running our console again. When we were testing this in the charts, we just used self-signed certificates, as they just kind of auto get set up if you turn off Cert Manager in the chart. It's like a couple minutes more work to do the same thing for Omnibus, and I didn't bother doing that for this demo. So doing this instead, but you could set up a self-signed certificate instead of having to modify the code to get around that. So we're loaded into the environment. One of the other things, so once, if you've changed something in the config, you can also check that it's actually made it into the application directly using GitLab config in the Rails code base. The casing is wrong and always has been. So off this config object, you can index any of the GitLab YML settings. So we know ours is under, so this setting happens to go under the extras, under extra. So we can see it got set in there as well. So we know that the setting made it through from Omnibus into the Rails application. Often this is, you know, for a lot of our settings, this might be the extent of what we have to test for Omnibus, just to know that it made it in, you know, and it's kind of up to the Rails application. For the MR that we were looking at that made this change, we were also wanting to make sure that it made it into the UI and that this tag actually got rendered and we could find it on the signup page. So we were, you know, that wasn't happening even though this was being set, and we were trying to figure out why. So let's recall our the initial call I made. I think well, that's fine. It was auth helper, and we were checking this. So this gates whether it was being rendered in the UI or not. And you can see that this time around, we got an error. So this is the first indicator that you know, that calling it this way maybe isn't helpful. So the error we're getting is that there's a method that doesn't exist under extra config. So it's line 173. And you know, it was calling into extra config, which is provided by a completely separate helper. So that's, you know, when you run into this, when you're dealing with helpers, often they are calling things from other helpers. And we, on kind of a side tangent here, we ended up in this else condition, which is fine, but we can also, we were trying to test this one. So let's quickly enable the feature. This is behind a feature flag right now. And we call it again, and we get the same error, but now it is on a different line, so 170. So now we're in here. So how do we load more of the helpers? Well, in the page we're on, you saw there was this this helper method in the console. So that's one of the ways you can load the helper. So if you call helper, it gives you an kind of a scope of all of the helpers for view helpers. Yeah, it gives you this action view. So we can actually call any helper off of it. So instead of calling off helper dot the method we were looking for, you can just call helper. And it will often have access to all of the helpers being loaded. In this case, it won't, but that's because this will be an example of something even a little bit more complicated. So we're calling it off of helper. that now loaded it as a helper with all of the other helpers, and now had extra configs. So we no longer get that issue, but you see we run into a different issue: undefined method current user. So current user is a helper, but it's not one that we've built into the GitLab Rails application. It's one provided by a gem called devise, which handles our sessions and logins and signups and stuff like that. And the way it does it is it doesn't add its helpers until a controller is actually loaded. So when a controller is loaded that extends from a devise controller, it has like a hook that during load action, it injects this current user helper. So we actually haven't had any load action, like we're in a console, we haven't loaded any controller, we haven't loaded up a request or anything like that. So this helper was never ever added. So it doesn't exist, and we're having a hard time testing this helper. There's a couple things you can do. So we could explicitly load the devise helpers. And there's a couple ways we could do that. We could just trigger the load event, which is like, it's like, this isn't important because we're not actually gonna do this, but it's like call on load, and then this is an action controller. And that happens to be the thing that devise is listening for, is on load events for action controllers. And we could load that up. But if you do that and you call us again, what will happen is it'll still error. It just won't error on this method. It'll error on the fact that it can't actually get the current user because we're missing a request. And that's where users come from, on the request object, session IDs. And that will be missing. So this is kind of the really what I was trying to get at in this call. Is the next thing is when we have a piece of code we're trying to debug and it's expecting to be run in the Rails environment that actually is running, a web server and requests, and is loaded in a controller and has a route and all these things. Like, how do we test that? And so the answer to that is this app helper in the console. So one of the things we can do is, well, we can just call app, but which will just create one, but we could change it. But it's created an app. Simply creating one isn't going to help this. But the app itself has its own list of helpers. Oh no, it doesn't. It has response and request objects, I guess. And controller objects. So you'll notice these aren't returning like method not found, but they are nil. So the helper methods actually also chain off of controllers, but we don't have a controller. But that'll come here in a second. So we don't have any of this stuff, but we now have the kind of the vehicle that normally has that information, the application. So how do we make it have that information? Well, you just tell it to actually do a request. So in the application, you can simply do a GET request it isn't actually like going over the network or anything like that. It's like within the routes and context of the running application without using, an HTTP stack, just running the code that at the Rails app standpoint that would happen if one did come in. So it doesn't actually matter for this test what endpoint we called, but we're going to call app get. You can see it started a request and it was processed by the registrations controller. A layout was rendered, all this other stuff. We got a response of 200. But the interesting thing now is those things we were looking at before. So app response now has a response. App request is now populated. And quite interestingly, if we do controller, we actually have a controller populated for the controller that responded to that request. So now, like everything in the application is populated. There's even a view, because like the view that was rendered has been populated. So kind of everything has been populated. And the final thing we can do is, as I mentioned before, the controller method has the helpers scope, which gives us an action view that is scoped to all the helpers. So off of this thing, we can now call our method and hopefully not get an error and finally have gone all the way through it. So yeah, so now we have all the information we need to run the this helper all the way to completion. So when you're dealing with a helper that like you're trying to debug why it's not enabled or why it's not doing what it's doing, you might run into these sorts of problems where it's a little bit difficult to validate that the simple view helper is actually working the way you want, because you're running into difficulties that it's expecting. It's expecting to not be what we saw. It's not expecting to be loaded in isolation. It's a helper. It's expected to be, and it's not even a class. It's just a module. It's expected to be included in other classes in Ruby. So running it in isolation is a little unexpected. Sometimes it'll work fine. Like for these methods here, you see, they explicitly call other, static methods on other classes that these might have their own issues, but likely not based on the way they're called. They probably would have been fine. But anything that is now relying on helpers, like we know that anything with current user, for example, is relying on there being not just the devise helpers in there, but also there being a request object in order to pull a session ID off of and stuff like that. So when you run into those issues, kind of these helper methods in the Rails console, and specifically really app, and just populating it with a GET request to populate some sort of request object is kind of the tip and trick I wanted to show off today. So that's it for me. Does anyone have any questions?
This is cool. So does this happen to be documented already, or is this something we should add so we can test future MRs?
I don't know that this is documented anywhere. So this is this is kind of it's documented in like Ruby on Rails documentation, and we probably call out generally to it, but I don't think it's called out specifically. And it would be interesting to call it out for us because we're not always in the Rails code base, so we can't expect it to be always experts in all of these sorts of things. But B, confirming these settings are definitely things that we often do. Not always down into the helper level, but definitely what I showed before with GitLab config, and then calling into anything in the config. I don't know what we have. Post maybe, I'm not sure, but anything that's populated into the GitLab YML. Often we want to make sure that not only did it make into the YML, but we want to make sure that it didn't have a spelling mistake. And the easiest way to do that is, or if it did have a spelling mistake, that at least that spelling mistake was also used in the application for the variable name. And the easiest way to do that is to call into the config object. So certainly looking for it in the config object when we edit something is important. But yeah, probably for distribution, it would make sense to add something like this to the documentation.
So eventually this MR, I guess, will have to get replicated into the charts. So did we test it the same way, like pop into task runner pod and run the same commands in the console?
Yep. Yeah, so in this case, and for this MR, we already merged it in charts and did that. When what we run into with this is often we were just checking for this MR in charts. All we did was check is it extra. Yeah, we checked extra, saw it was there, and then we actually hit the UI and saw and like looked at the HTML and saw that the setting that we put in was making it into the iframe request for loading this piece from Google Tag Manager. So we didn't have to go in and debug the method in that case. What happened is in the Omnibus MR, for whatever reason, it wasn't working as smoothly, or there was something wrong in the setup. Or at least that was my case when I quickly tested it. Dimitri might have run into different issues, but for whatever reason, we wanted to validate separate from the UI and debug what was like holding us up. Like, did we forget to make it a .com instance? Did we forget to enable the feature flag type thing? So that's why we dove deeper in this case. So yeah, often you'll, when things are working well, you're likely just be checking for distribution. You'll often just be checking that it made it into the application. It's really when things aren't working that, we end up having to debug a little bit deeper, just ensure that it wasn't just our mistake on not getting the environment set up quite right.
Cool, makes sense.
Okay, I think that's it for the demo.
Thanks, everyone. Just a quick shout out, the development group conversation is happening now if folks want to jump in. Thanks, DJ.
Have a great day.